I think we can begin by focusing critical attention on the contrast between figurative language and literal language. Figurative language is the stuff literature is made of. Literal language is exactly what it is. Scientific writing, for example, makes use of literal language. Literal language aims at exactness, precision, accuracy. It does not attempt to convey anything more than itself. Figurative language, on the other hand, always attempts to convey more than, other than what it is. Literature would not be literature if it were written in literal language. Literature is literature because it uses figurative language. And figurative language constantly attempts to convey more than itself, to convey other than itself. The first figure of speech I would like to deal with is the most basic one, the simile. In a simile, a comparison is set up between two things. This comparison is explicit. This comparison is very clear to the reader. A simile makes use of terms like, as, and so. The Sanskrit term for simile is upama. In Sanskrit literature, Kalidasa is looked upon as the supreme master of the simile. Upama Kalidasasya. Upama Kalidasasya. The classic examples of the simile are the two similes that are found in the opening stanza of A Red, Red Rose by Robert Burns. Let me try to remember the lines. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. We now come to the second figure of speech, the metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech which establishes a comparison between two things, but the comparison is implicit. It is not explicit. The metaphor does not state the comparison. It only suggests the comparison. A very famous example of the metaphor is found in As You Like It, William Shakespeare's As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7, right, Scene 7. I quote, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players, unquote. Jesus makes use of a powerful metaphor when he declares in John 10:11, I am the good shepherd. A pun or a quibble is a figure of speech which utilizes the different meanings of a word to create a special effect. In preface to Shakespeare, Dr. Johnson complained that a quibble was to Shakespeare the fatal Cleopatra for which he lost the world and was content to lose it. A very famous example of the quibble or the pun is found in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet 3:1, where the dying Mercutio declares that he will be a grave man tomorrow. Personification is a figure of speech in which a thing which is not human is given human form, or a thing which is abstract is presented in human form. An oft quoted example of personification is found in Emily Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. This is what she says: because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Unquote. A transferred epithet is a figure of speech in which the epithet or the modifier detaches itself from the noun. It actually qualifies and attaches itself to another term. Thus, the epithet is transferred from one noun to another. A very well-known example of the transferred epithet is the term blind mouths. Blind mouths in John Milton's Lycidas. A hyperbole is a figure of speech in which something is presented as better than or bigger than it actually is. A hyperbole is a deliberate effort at exaggeration. An excellent example of hyperbole is found in William Shakespeare's Macbeth 5:1, where Lady Macbeth exclaims, I quote, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand," unquote. The opposite of hyperbole is litotes. If hyperbole is overstatement, exaggeration, litotes is understatement. Litotes is a figure of speech which makes use of a negative statement in order to emphasize a positive meaning. I think I said litotes is understatement. It would be more accurate to say that litotes is ironic understatement. A very fine example of the figure of speech of litotes is found in the Old English epic Beowulf. I quote, "The sword wasn't useless to the warrior." Unquote. I repeat, the sword wasn't useless to the warrior. Apostrophe literally means turning away. Apostrophe is a figure of speech in which the speaker addresses somebody or something, and the somebody is usually not present there, and the something is usually an abstract quality, and the addressee thus is unable to respond to the address. A striking example of the use of the apostrophe is found in John Donne's oft anthologized sonnet beginning with the words, "Death be not proud." I think it is Holy Sonnet number 10. This is how the poem begins. I quote, "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful." Unquote. Anaphora is a figure of speech in which repetition is made use of. Words or groups of words are repeated at close intervals in order to generate a special effect. The very term anaphora reminds me of the electrifying words embedded in the rousing peroration of the great speech that Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister of Britain, delivered in the House of Commons on June the 4th, 1940. Churchill said, and I quote, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Unquote. Pathetic fallacy is a figure of speech in which human feelings and human responses are given to non-human things, including animals and inanimate objects. The term pathetic fallacy was coined by John Ruskin. Every schoolboy knows the great example of the pathetic fallacy that is found in the opening of William Wordsworth's lyric popularly titled Daffodils. "I wandered lonely as a cloud." Paradox is a figure of speech which appears to be false and self-contradictory on the surface, but which, on further examination, reveals a kernel of truth. A brilliant example of this figure of speech is George Bernard Shaw's famous statement: youth is wasted on the young. Youth is wasted on the young. Onomatopoeia is the figure of speech in which the sound echoes the sense. A fantastic example of onomatopoeia is found in The Princess of Alfred, Lord Tennyson. Let me try to remember it. The moan of doves in immemorial elms, and the murmuring of innumerable bees. You can actually listen to the sound of the bees when you hear the passage, when you read the passage. Oxymoron is a figure of speech which has two parts, and the two parts contradict each other. A lovely example of oxymoron is found in the Idylls of the King of Alfred Lord Tennyson. This is what Tennyson says: his honour, rooted in dishonour stood, and faith unfaithful kept him falsely true. Ugma means yoking. Ugma is a figure of speech in which a word with two very different meanings is used in the same verbal structure in such a way as to make both the meanings applicable. The word attaches itself to one context in one sense and attaches itself to another context in another sense, and both the contexts are within the same verbal structure. A stellar example of the figure of speech, zeugma, is found in The Rape of the Lock of Alexander Pope in the line, or stain her honour or her new brocade. I repeat, or stain her honour or her new brocade. Irony is a figure of speech which occurs when there is a gap between what is said and what is meant. Or, to put it in another way, the speaker says something but means something very different. An immortal exemplification of the figure of speech, irony, is found in the famous speech of Mark Antony in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Antony says, "For Brutus is an honourable man." I repeat, for Brutus is an honourable man. Alliteration is a figure of speech in which consonant sounds are repeated at close intervals. Every schoolboy knows this example from William Blake. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, from Blake's highly anthologized poem, The Tiger. Assonance is a figure of speech in which vowel sounds are repeated at close intervals. A very fine example of assonance is the opening line of the second stanza of The Bells by Edgar Allan Poe. The line goes thus: "Hear the mellow wedding bells. Hear the mellow wedding bells." Anacoleuthon is not a very well-known figure of speech. Anacoleuthon is a figure of speech in which the expected syntactic structure is disrupted in order to generate a pause and to provoke the reader or the listener to think more deeply. A memorable example of anacoleuthon is found in John Milton's Lycidas. Had he been there, for what could that have done? I repeat, had he been there, for what could that have done? Synecdoche is a figure of speech in which a part stands for the whole or the whole stands for a part. The example that readily comes to the mind of the student of Victorian literature is the line, or rather the two lines, from Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. I quote, "Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day." Unquote. I repeat, Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day. Unquote. Metonymy is a figure of speech in which an attribute or an adjunct of something stands for the thing itself. A very fine example of metonymy is found in Ode to a Nightingale of John Keats. "Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south." I repeat, "Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south." Symbolism is a very important area, and I intend to engage an independent class on it. For the time being, I shall define symbol as a figure of speech in which one thing is made to represent another, in which one thing stands for another. A poet who made masterly use of symbolism is W.B. Yeats, and the poetry of W.B. Yeats gains much of its richness from his use of symbols. Among the important symbols in Yeatsian poetry are the winding stair, the rose, the gyre. Image is a striking word picture. When the writer uses words to create sharply etched pictures, he makes use of imagery. What better exemplification can there be of this figure of speech of imagery than that immortal line in Macbeth, Act 3, Scene 2. Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. I repeat, oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife.